Hey there everyone, Professor Zeeb here, and we're going to talk about some infant reflexes. This is kind of an interesting part of the class. In fact, we're going to go over these sort of automated reflexes that infants possess. And keep in mind that you can actually try some of these on an infant. So if you have access to an infant with the parent's permission, of course, you can actually try some of these. And I want to encourage you to do so because they're kind of fascinating. All right, so let's talk about some infant reflexes as we go to our slides here. All righty. So infant reflexes. So just as an introduction here, we're going to find that brand new babies, which we call neonates, usually about birth to 1 month, are born with these natural reflexes. In other words, they come pre-built, if you would, of these reflexes. And most of them we're going to find are probably going to disappear within a month or two. Some of them do last a few months. So the point is that babies are born with these and then they sort of fade away after a few months, depending on which one we're talking about. In fact, a lot of them become more voluntary as time progresses. All right, so let's look at what a reflex actually is. So a reflex, the way we would technically define that, is an automated response to certain stimuli. In other words, it's an inborn reflex where if we stimulate the child in a particular way, they will act in a very characteristic fashion, almost like it's automated and they're not thinking, it just sort of happens and is produced. For example, the eye blink is a very classic one where if something gets close to your eye naturally blinks. You don't really have to think about that. So that's kind of what we mean, is that neonates come with a whole host of these inborn reflexes that are displayed. And once again, I want to encourage you to try to use some of those or check them out. Most of these reflexes are for various reasons, including survival. It may help the infant survive in some way. It actually may help protect them in some way, so it's serving a protection sort of fashion, or to help them sustain life. So a lot of times we think they're built in to enable the infant to survive, or possibly to develop future skills, such as mobility is an example of that. So typically it's survival, protection, refining, movement, that kind of thing. Research has revealed that most of them are controlled by the brainstem. So we think that this part of the brain is developed at birth to a certain extent and allows these reflexes to sort of happen. In fact, some of our drastic evidence of this is that we've had cases where babies were born with most of their cerebral cortex missing, which is the master part of the brain. In other words, they just had a few sections there with the brainstem, and they were still able to show these reflexes. So that's really give us a lot of evidence that a lot of these reflexes do come from the brainstem. Okay, so now we're going to go over several of these. So we're going to just kind of go through them one at a time, and I'll define them for you, and then some of them I'm actually going to demonstrate, if you would. So our very first one we're going to talk about is called the plantar grasp. So with this particular reflex, what's happening is you take the infant's foot, for example, and if you press your thumb against the ball of their foot, their toes will curl inward like so, okay? So obviously this could be for grasping things with their foot, but we also think it may be involved in breastfeeding as well to help stimulate the breast. So that is called the plantar grasp. The next reflex we're going to talk about is called the Babinski. So the Babinski, I can even say that word. So the Babinski is where you take their foot, and if you stroke their sole, you're going to find that their toes fan out like so, okay? So that's one of those reflexes you can easily test with a young infant if you do have access. So once again, stroking the sole and then their toes spread out or fan out. Okay, so next we go to rooting. I think for this one, we're going to go to the camera here to demonstrate this one. Okay, so to help me with my demonstrations, I'm going to incorporate little Susie here. This is actually one of my daughter's dolls. She would probably be cringing if she knew I was using this for work. But anyway, and this always kind of creeped me out because they look so real. But anyway, let's imagine that little Susie here is a newborn. And if we use rooting, what's happening is we're lightly touching her cheek like so. like with your finger or something, they will turn their head and start sucking. So it's pretty obvious what that's for, to stimulate breastfeeding. So it's just lightly touching the cheek. They will turn their head and start sucking with that. All right, thank you, little Susie. Let's move on to our next one. Sorry, guys. So the next one is just simply the sucking reflex. Pretty self-explanatory with this one is where you place liquid or something on their lips or contacting their mouth, if you would, and then they'll start sucking, obviously to stimulate feeding. That's pretty self-explanatory. The next one is the Moro. Okay, so with this one, let's go back to the camera here. Let's say you were holding little Susie here, so you're holding them. If they felt like they were going to drop, so let's say you acted like you were going to drop them. Now this is one that I would not recommend doing to a child for obvious reasons, but a sudden noise or the feeling of being dropped, what they will do is they'll stretch out their arms and legs and then hug themselves and potentially cry. So we think this may be like an act of self-preservation, like if they fell, it would help protect them. So once again, a sudden noise, sudden loud noise, or a sudden drop, for example, would cause them to stretch out their arms and then hug themselves to protect themselves. That's called the Moro. Okay, so next we go to the grasping reflex, which is pretty self-explanatory. You may have noticed if you've ever interacted with a young infant that if you place your finger in their hand, they will automatically grab onto it. That's such a cool thing when you experience that with a young child. So that's called the grasping reflex. Once again, this could be stimulating movement and further development of motor skills in terms of their hands, their fine motor skills specifically, which allows them that coordination. Okay, so that's called the grasping reflex. Our next reflex is called the stepping reflex. Once again, pretty self-explanatory. So if you were holding a young infant over a table, for example, and you lightly put their feet down on the surface of the table, like you see them doing so, they will start to move their legs. So we think that this may be actually a precursor to walking. In fact, they do this in the womb. We have discovered that some of these reflexes are actually present in the womb, and so they may be actually bouncing off the amniotic sac or pushing on it and that kind of thing. But the bottom line is that the stepping reflex is stimulating the movement of the legs and possibly preparing their body for future coordination and walking and being mobile eventually, of course. All right, so next we go to our last one, which is called the tonic neck, okay? This one has the kind of interesting nickname of being the fencer because it emulates the pose of a fencer, like a swordsman, if you would, okay? So here, typically the infant is on their back and they're awake. You may have seen this in a young child before where they turn their head. You'll notice that the arm in that direction will straighten out and then they will flex their other arm on the other side, almost like a fencer. So if you could actually see that, they're stretching out one arm in the direction that they're actually looking and then flexing the other side of their body. So we call that the tonic neck, obviously because it has to do with the turning of the head. And once again, the fencer pose because it sort of looks like a fencer conducting that sort of activity. Okay, so anyway, guys, as you can see that there's a lot of different reflexes involved with infants. Like I said, I want to encourage you to try some of these and let me know what happens. Some of them probably shouldn't try, such as the Moro, but anyway, you understand what I'm saying. It's pretty interesting that infants actually have these. And once again, just to kind of wrap this up, we really think it's for survival, protection, and laying down the foundation for future movement and skill. All right, so that will basically conclude our lecture here on infant reflexes. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you online or in class.